Racist cop detains black veteran. The courtroom wasn't ready for this ending. The night was still, the kind of deep, quiet darkness that settles over small towns after most of the streetlights have blinked out. Malik Harris drove home from his late shift at the hospital, his uniform shirt neatly pressed, the faint scent of antiseptic still clinging to him. The radio hummed low, a comfort against the empty roads. Up ahead, a flash of red and blue shattered the calm. He slowed, instinct tightening his chest. A police cruiser slid in behind him, its lights strobing across the trees. Malik pulled over to the side, hands already resting on the steering wheel in plain sight. He had been through this before, too many times, and every muscle in his body was a lesson in how to make himself look as unthreatening as possible. The officer approached with a heavy, deliberate stride. Her name tag caught the reflection of the cruiser's lights, Sergeant K. Waller. She was tall, pale, her hair pulled into a severe bun. Even before she spoke, her eyes swept over him with a quick, cutting judgment. "License and registration," she said, her voice clipped, like she was addressing a suspect, not a driver. "Yes, ma'am," Malik replied, moving slowly, narrating each motion, reaching for his wallet, passing over his ID, then retrieving the registration from the glove box. "What brings you out here this late?" she asked, but it didn't sound like a question. It sounded like an accusation. "I'm coming from work. County General Hospital. I'm a trauma nurse." Her brow lifted, but her tone stayed flat. "Mind stepping out of the vehicle for me?" There it was, the quiet shift from routine stop to something heavier, colder. Malik's stomach sank. The night air was cool against Malik's face as he stepped out, his hospital ID badge swinging from the lanyard around his neck. SGT. Waller's flashlight beam cut across his chest, then down to his shoes, lingering as if they might tell her something about him. "Turn around. Hands on the hood," she ordered. Malik hesitated, confusion flashing across his face. "Ma'am, may I ask what this is about?" "You match the description of a suspect from a break-in earlier tonight," she said, though her eyes never met his. "Black male, late 20s, driving a dark sedan." Malik glanced at his own car, a silver four-door with a hospital parking sticker still on the windshield. He wanted to protest, to tell her that half the men in town could fit that vague description, but he knew where that road led. He complied, placing his palms flat on the cold metal of the hood. The sound of her gloves adjusting seemed unnaturally loud. She patted him down briskly, impersonal yet tinged with a suspicion that stung deeper than her touch. "You carrying any weapons?" "No, ma'am," he said, his voice low but steady. She pulled back, still studying him as if she were waiting for a mistake to materialize. "Stay right here." Malik stood motionless, the rhythmic flash of the cruiser's lights painting the empty road in red and blue. In the distance, a neighbor's curtain twitched. Someone was watching, but not stepping outside. In that moment, Malik wasn't Malik the nurse who had just saved a life hours ago. He was just another shadow under the glare of suspicion. Sergeant Waller returned after a few tense minutes, her radio still crackling with static. "Turn around. You're being detained for questioning." Malik's heart thudded, though his expression stayed calm. "Detained? On what grounds?" "Like I said, you match the suspect description," she replied, her tone harder now, as if his very question was an act of defiance. She pulled out a pair of handcuffs, the metal glinting under the street lamp. Malik felt the weight of the moment settle over him. He glanced once at the hospital badge still hanging from his neck, then up at her. "Ma'am, I'm not resisting," he said softly, "but you're making a mistake. Hands behind your back." The cuffs clicked shut, colder than the night air. A part of Malik had grown used to this, the quick judgment, the presumption of guilt, but another part, the one that still believed in fairness, burned with quiet outrage. She guided him toward the cruiser, her grip firm on his arm. A passing car slowed, its driver peering out the window before continuing on. Malik's mind raced, not just with the embarrassment, but with the thought of who might see the footage later if someone in the neighborhood had been filming. The back seat door opened with a metallic groan, and Malik was guided inside. The door shut, sealing him in that small, stale space where every breath seemed louder than it should be. Through the plexiglass partition, he could see Sergeant Waller radioing something in, her voice low but clipped. Whatever happened next, Malik knew this was no longer just a misunderstanding. It was about to become something much bigger. The cruiser pulled away from the curb, its tires crunching over gravel. Malik sat stiffly in the back seat, his wrists aching from the cold bite of the cuffs. Through the tinted glass, the familiar streets passed by like distant scenery, his own neighborhood, the park where he used to run, the small cafe where the barista knew his order by heart. All of it felt suddenly foreign. Sergeant Waller didn't speak at first. Her eyes stayed locked on the road, her jaw tight. The radio hissed with static before another voice came through. Negative on suspect match. Break-in suspect still at large. Malik's head lifted slightly. He knew what that meant. She had the wrong person. But she didn't slow down. "Ma'am," Malik said carefully, "you just heard it. I'm not the suspect." She didn't answer. Instead, she turned down a side street leading away from the main road. The station was in the opposite direction. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with suspicion. "Still bringing you in for questioning," she said, as if the radio call had been irrelevant. The unfairness hit him like a weight pressing against his chest. This wasn't about a crime anymore. It was about control. Malik leaned back, staring at the partition between them, his reflection faint against the glass. He thought of the patients whose lives he'd fought to save just hours earlier, the precision and care it took to keep someone breathing. And now, here he was, treated as though his very existence was a threat. Outside, the night grew quieter, the streets emptier. The cruiser rolled toward the looming shape of the station, its lights casting harsh shadows against the building. Malik knew that once those doors closed behind him, the fight to be heard would become even harder. The station smelled faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant. Harsh fluorescent lights hummed overhead, draining the warmth from every corner. Malik was led through a side entrance, past a bored-looking desk sergeant who barely glanced up. "SGT." Waller's grip on his arm didn't loosen until she guided him to a small, windowless room with cinder-block walls. She removed the cuffs, but only after telling him to keep his hands where I can see them. A uniformed officer with a clipboard stepped in. "Name?" "Malik Harris," he said, his voice steady despite the thrum of frustration in his chest. The officer scribbled something, then gestured toward a camera mounted to the wall. "Stand there. Face forward." The shutter clicked. One flash, and Malik's face was captured, flattened, stripped of context, forever archived as detainee. Next came the fingerprinting. The officer guided his hands, rolling each fingertip onto the scanner with clinical detachment. Malik caught himself looking at his own fingers, the same ones that had stitched wounds and started IVs hours earlier, now pressed into a machine as if they belonged to someone dangerous. When the paperwork was done, Sergeant Waller stood in the doorway. "You'll wait in holding until we sort this out." Holding was a narrow cell with a metal bench and a single flickering light. The heavy door closed behind him with a thud that echoed in his bones. Malik sat down, clasping his hands in his lap. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly, every second stretching out. He thought of the hospital, of his patients who might be wondering why their nurse hadn't shown up for the early shift. He also thought of how quickly a life could be rewritten, not by the truth, but by perception. And tonight, perception had him locked behind steel. The hours dragged. Malik sat on the cold bench, his elbows on his knees, listening to the muffled sounds of the station. Phones ringing, doors opening and closing, the low rumble of voices he couldn't quite make out. At some point, a different officer appeared at the bars, clipboard in hand. "Harris, right?" "Yes," Malik said, lifting his head. The officer flipped through the papers, his brow furrowing. "Says here you're a nurse?" "That's correct. Trauma unit. County General." The man nodded slowly, glancing over his shoulder before lowering his voice. "Just curious, did you serve? Military?" Malik blinked at the question. "Yes. For years, Army. Medic." The officer's brows rose slightly. "Huh. Hold tight a second." He walked off, leaving Malik with a thread of unease. Minutes later, voices rose somewhere down the hall, sharp, clipped, and clearly directed at Sergeant Waller. Malik couldn't hear the words, but the tone told him everything. A door slammed. Footsteps approached. The same officer returned, this time with keys in hand. "You're free to go? We, had a mistake in the system. Charges dropped. Sorry for the inconvenience." The phrase "sorry for the inconvenience" landed like a slap. Malik stepped out, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had been. "Wasn't just a mistake," Malik said quietly. "You knew from the start I wasn't your guy." The officer didn't answer. He just gestured toward the lobby. "Your belongings are at the front desk." As Malik walked down the hallway, he could feel the eyes of the station following him. Not just curiosity now, but something else. Recognition. Because in a few hours, when word spread about who exactly had been detained, the whole town would know the truth. 2 weeks later, Malik found himself walking up the courthouse steps, not as a defendant, but as a witness. The civil rights attorney he'd hired had been quick to act, filing a formal complaint that led to an internal hearing for Sergeant Waller. The marble lobby echoed with the low hum of conversations. Reporters lingered outside, their cameras ready, though none knew the full story yet. Inside the hearing room, wooden benches faced a long table where the panel of commissioners sat. To one side, Sergeant Waller was already in place, her uniform sharp, her posture rigid. She didn't look at Malik as he entered. When the clerk called his name, he stepped to the stand. The oath felt heavy on his tongue, the kind of promise that wasn't just about truth. It was about making the truth impossible to ignore. The attorney began. "Mr. Harris, can you describe the events of the night in question?" Malik recounted it calmly, fact by fact. The late drive home, the flashing lights, the vague suspect description, the cuffs, the detour from the station, the hours in holding. When he mentioned his military service, a ripple of murmurs passed through the room. It was clear, most people there had no idea. Malik let the silence stretch a moment before continuing. "I've worn a uniform. I've treated soldiers under fire. I've served this country. And that night, none of it mattered. I was just another black man on the side of the road." At the defense table, Waller's jaw tightened. The commissioners shifted in their seats. Even the court reporter paused, her eyes flicking briefly to him before her fingers resumed typing. This wasn't just testimony anymore. It was the moment the room began to feel the weight of what had really happened. The attorney leaned closer to the microphone. "Mr. Harris, at what point during your detention do you believe Sergeant Waller became aware that you were not the suspect?" Malik kept his voice steady. "As soon as the radio confirmed it. But instead of releasing me, she took me to the station anyway." A low murmur rippled through the gallery. One of the commissioners, a woman with sharp glasses and a sharper gaze, scribbled something in her notes. "Did she give you any explanation for continuing to hold you?" the attorney asked. "No," Malik said simply. "Just that I was being brought in for questioning." The defense attorney stood. "Mr. Harris, isn't it true that officers are allowed to bring in individuals for questioning if they believe it's relevant to an investigation?" Malik met his gaze. "If there's probable cause. But when the only cause is my skin color and the neighborhood I was driving through, that's not an investigation. It's profiling." A commissioner coughed into his hand, failing to hide a flicker of discomfort. The defense attorney hesitated, flipping through his notes. "And your military service? How exactly is that relevant to this hearing?" Malik's expression didn't change. "Because it's a reminder that I've risked my life for the freedoms this uniform is supposed to protect. And yet, in my own hometown, I was treated as a criminal for existing." The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel. Even a few people in uniform shifted uncomfortably on the back benches. For the first time, Sergeant Waller's eyes dropped to the table. By the second day of testimony, the hearing room was packed. Word had spread, not just about Malik's wrongful detention, but about his service record. Local veterans filled the benches, some wearing old unit caps, their presence a silent show of solidarity. The commissioners reviewed the evidence. Dashcam footage showing the moment the radio cleared Malik, time-stamped logs proving she kept him in custody long after knowing he wasn't the suspect. When the clip played on the projector, An audible gasp moved through the crowd. In the back row, an older veteran muttered, "That's unlawful detainment, plain and simple." The prosecutor leaned in. "Members of the commission, this is not an error in judgment. This is a willful abuse of authority." The defense tried to paint it as a misunderstanding, claiming Waller was on the side of caution. But the phrase fell flat in the charged air of the room. When Malik stepped down from the stand, several strangers nodded to him, small gestures, but heavy with meaning. During a recess, a reporter cornered him in the hallway. "Mr. Harris, do you believe Sergeant Waller should lose her badge over this?" Malik didn't hesitate. If the people who enforce the law can break it without consequence, the badge means nothing. By the time the hearing resumed, a new tension filled the air. People had come expecting a slap on the wrist, maybe a suspension. But now, for the first time, it felt like the unthinkable might happen. The commissioners filed back into the chamber, their expressions unreadable. Conversations in the gallery fell to a tense hush. The chairwoman cleared her throat. After reviewing the testimony, evidence, and departmental policy, this commission has reached a decision regarding Sergeant Waller. Malik sat in the front row, his hands clasped, eyes fixed forward. Waller stared at the tabletop, jaw tight. "It is the determination of this body," the chairwoman continued, "that Sergeant Waller's actions constituted an unlawful detention and demonstrated a pattern of bias inconsistent with the values and responsibilities of law enforcement." A murmur swept through the room, quick, sharp, and disbelieving. Effective immediately, Sergeant Waller is terminated from the Greenville Police Department. The words landed like a hammer. In the back, someone whispered, "They actually fired her?" As though saying it out loud might make it real. Waller's face went pale. She didn't look at Malik, didn't look at anyone, just stared straight ahead, her hands tightening into fists. The chairwoman gavelled the hearing to a close. "This matter is concluded." Malik exhaled, a slow, steady breath that seemed to carry months of weight. As the room stirred back to life, he caught sight of the veterans in the gallery, their nods of respect more powerful than any applause. For once, the system had not simply closed ranks. By evening, the news had spread across town. Headlines blared, "Police Sergeant fired after wrongful detention of local veteran." The story led every broadcast, with Malik's testimony replayed alongside the grainy dashcam footage that had sealed the case. At the hospital, co-workers stopped him in the hall, nurses, orderlies, even doctors he barely knew, offering quiet congratulations. One older nurse gripped his arm and said, "You stood up for all of us." In the neighborhood where he'd been pulled over, someone taped a handwritten note to a street lamp. "We saw. We remember. Thank you." That night, the community center filled for a hastily called town meeting. People spoke about profiling, about accountability, about how they wanted their police to look more like the people they served. Malik sat toward the back, listening more than speaking. He didn't want to be the center of it. The point wasn't him. The point was that a wrong had been righted, and that it couldn't stop there. Even the local paper's editorial board, which rarely criticized the police, ran a column calling the firing a necessary act in rebuilding trust. For some, the decision felt like a turning tide. For others, it was just one case in a sea of many. But for Malik, it was proof that pressure and truth could break through. A week later, Malik sat on his porch in the soft light of an early morning. The air was cool, the streets still quiet. His coffee steamed in the mug between his hands. The past few weeks had been a blur. News interviews, thank you letters from strangers, invitations to speak at community forums. He hadn't asked for any of it, but he understood why it was happening. People needed a story where the truth didn't get buried. He thought about that night, the flashing lights, the cold cuffs, the way his identity had been stripped down to nothing but suspicion. He thought, too, about the hearing room, how the commissioners had listened, how the tide had shifted, how a system that so often failed had, just this once, done the right thing. It wasn't victory. Not really. Not when so many others would never get a hearing, never see justice. But it was a start. Malik sipped his coffee, watching the sun creep over the rooftops. Somewhere, a siren wailed faintly in the distance. He wondered if it was headed to a call that would be handled with care or with bias. All he knew was that he'd keep showing up, in his work, in his community, and if necessary, in court, to remind those with power that their authority meant nothing without accountability. As the light grew brighter, Malik set down his mug and smiled faintly. One case didn't fix the world, but it proved it could be done, and that was enough to keep going. Thank you for watching. Subscribe me and hit the notification bell to not miss new stories. Bye.